And I remember looking, oh my God, I can't believe I paid this much in interest. And I don't make enough to do that. It's not just the portfolio management part that you get working with an advisor. It's also the tax planning. It just starts with understanding what you have. It's also understanding how it's treated, because different types of accounts have different treatment from a tax perspective, and pulling money out has different impact. If you get divorced and you had a 401k and you don't change the beneficiary from your ex, guess what happens if you pass away? Your ex gets the money.
Hey, Phil, welcome to the show. I am super excited for our conversation today.
Hi, Amber. So happy to be here. I'm looking forward to our conversation as well.
As before we hit record, I was just saying to you, just with my work with working with divorced women, and as a divorced woman myself, God, this is such like what you guys are doing at Apprise Wealth Management for really helping women who are facing new beginnings. I just think that it is so powerful and so needed. I myself know that when I got divorced, and also if somebody's listening who's not divorced, I just think even just women in general, I think the financial piece of things sometimes can feel very intimidating, but especially speaking to women who have navigated a big life transition in midlife like divorce, the financial piece of it and being worried about your financial future and financial independence and all of that. I mean, it keeps a lot of women up at night.
I'm sure that it does. And I think one of the reasons that this happens is because if you think about that traditional model that we've had for many years, usually she's responsible for taking care of the kids, takes care of the finances, then she doesn't really know what's going on, and she doesn't have the experience, and she doesn't know what questions to ask or anything about it, because we don't teach about it. We don't give financial education in our schools either. So it's a really hard thing.
Absolutely. One of the things I tell women, and this is why I'm so on fire about what I do, teaching women how to create their own businesses, because that financial independence is such a huge thing, but helping women to improve their financial IQ, I just think so powerful. So I'm really excited to share some really important tips with the listeners. I want to just kick that off by asking, what's one small but powerful habit that can help women to feel more in control of their finances right now?
I guess there's a couple things that really come to mind. First is if you want to save anything. I call this pay yourself first. If you have money that's coming in, make sure that some of it's going to your savings and set it up automatically so it never hits your checking account, because if you don't ever see it, you won't miss it. And it's a great way to automate your savings and make sure that they happen. And then the second thing is, for some people, budgeting is a four-letter word. I get that. Just understand what your inflows and outflows are. And as long as what you're taking in is greater than what you're putting out from a financial perspective, you're in good shape to start. That means you shouldn't be taking on debt and things like that. So that's really important to keep in mind as well.
And I know some women listening to this are probably thinking, okay, Phil, that sounds great. I'm just going through a divorce. I feel like I don't have extra money. I'm worried about kind of living paycheck to support check plus my income. Should women still be prioritizing the savings piece of it? That can feel very scary. I don't even know where I would find the money, but here's what I know about budgeting is that when we feel we don't have the money, oftentimes what it just requires is a reprioritization of where you're spending your money. Now, that's a general statement. That's not true for everybody, but you're making your priority to save, then you start to get resourceful. So now all of a sudden you start looking, hey, do I need to get Starbucks 3 times a week, or do I need to do X, Y, and Z? So what would be your advice for that woman regarding the saving piece of it for someone who feels money's tight?
I remember when I bought my first home, and it was before I even got married. And I was like, I don't know if I can afford this. There's a mortgage payment. There's all these obligations. So what I did is I used to carry a little piece of paper in my pocket, and we used cash a lot more back then. So then credit cards make it a little bit easier to track, but I made sure that I knew everything that I spent. And I did that for like a month or two. And then I put it into a spreadsheet, and I looked and I said, okay, these are all things that I spend money on, but if times got tough, I don't have to spend money on them anymore. And that made me comfortable that I could afford what I was doing, because I knew that I had the capacity to make the cuts where I needed to if times got difficult. Just getting a handle on where you stand is such an important thing.
So, and I know now there's certain apps, Mint is one that they operate Mint. There's a lot of different apps out there that I think connect directly to your bank account that can categorize where you're spending money. I think that's a great exercise for anybody who's trying to get control of their money, is really understand where it's going. Forget about that $50, $75, $100 trip to Target, which so many of us women are guilty of doing. And I think it's just a really good place to start. So is there sort of a rule of thumb that no matter where you're at financially, you should be really saving? I'm not talking about necessarily retirement saving. So there's obviously like different types of savings. With cash saving, there's long-term saving. Is there some sort of guideline or percentage that you like to tell your clients what they should be focusing on?
So you could think if there's a 50, 30, 20 rule, and that 50% is going to go towards things you have to spend on, like your housing and your food. And then 30% can be for your wants and some of the things that you'd like to have. And then the other 20% is going to either go to savings or paying down debt.
Let's talk about debt for a second, though. Like, do you recommend paying down debt first before you start saving? And my own, like, trying to get back on track financially. When it comes to credit cards versus saving in a bank account, my financial planner had me, what's the return of the money going into the savings account versus how much interest are you paying? Prioritizing getting down high interest credit card debt first. Then once you get that paid off, then put that money in savings. Is that kind of a good plan? Or should you still be saving money in like a savings account while you're paying down credit card debt?
Generally, I would want to pay off those high credit cards because it's so expensive. The only exception that I would make is if you have a job and that your employer is putting money into your 401k. And let's say it's the standard match, which says you put in 6% and they give you 3%. So that 3%, that's really like a 50% return on the money that you're putting into that account. And when they hired you, they assumed you were going to do that, paying you a little bit less because they're putting that money. So like that money I would always save, even if I had the credit card, because that's a 50% return. That's higher than the rate you pay on the credit card. But after that, like I went through this myself. I ended up paying for a lot of my college and related expenses on credit card. And I remember looking, oh my God, I can't believe I paid this much in interest. And I don't make enough to do that. So I put in place a plan to pay off that debt. And I started with the highest rate card first. That's the way that I like to do it. That's called Avalanche, I believe. And then the snowball is when you pick the lowest balance because you want a sense of accomplishment. So you pay off the lowest balance and then you attack the next higher balance. But either way, when I think about that savings, I want to look at, like you said, what's the return that I can get from that money versus what the cost is of having that debt.
Absolutely. I want to talk a little bit of retirement savings, though, for women who are in midlife, who are worried about outliving their retirement savings. What's one step that they can do today to feel more secure with that when it comes to retirement? This is particularly, especially for a lot of my listeners who are entrepreneurs who are not getting that 401k matching and doing all that retirement thing. I know that that's a big barrier for a lot of women who want to leave corporate America and start their own business. Walking away from automatic retirement savings is super scary. I mean, I've had to navigate that myself. What's something that they could do to feel more secure about outliving what they have in their retirement?
When it comes to saving for retirement, it's never too late to start, but it's also never too early to start. And when you have your own business, I mean, it's something I go through because this is my business. Depending upon your income, you can do something like contribute to a simple thing. And right now you can put $7,000 in and it's $8,000 if you're 50 or over. You can also create kind of like your own solo 401k or a KEO or a SEP or something like that that allows you to save for retirement from your business. And that money that you save for a business, you don't get a company match, but you can at least get a tax break from it.
If women are worried about their retirement savings, even if they're not an entrepreneur, is there anything that they should be doing? I know just the earlier the better, but is there anything else that they need to be mindful of? Like, should they be trying to just max it out when they can? Or like, what is that?
Like I said, you can put money into an IRA. At least do that. And that's $7,000 or $8,000 if you're 50-year-old. At least you do that. I mean, that's something that even married couples sometimes forget about that. Like she's working and he's not, because I see both. They're not putting money into the spouse's account. You can still save for the spouse. There's the income requirement that having earned income that you need to put money into an IRA. It's based upon that household income, not just one person.
After a major shift, divorce, what's the first financial move? Like somebody going through divorce, or maybe they lose a job or whatever that looks like. What's the very first financial move you recommend that they do to regain stability and confidence with their money?
It just starts with understanding what you have. A lot of times we don't know. And it's what you have. And it's also understanding how it's treated, because different types of accounts have different treatment from a tax perspective, and pulling money out has different impacts. So you want to make sure you really understand what you have first.
What's a surprising mistake that you see women make when managing their money after either a career break or a life transition? Where are they misstepping?
I think probably the most common thing is when it comes to money, men, rightly or wrongly, typically are more brazen. They have more confidence. They're more aggressive. That can hurt you. But the data actually shows that women are better investors than men because of this. But one thing that a lot of women do is they get too conservative. If we think about putting money into a savings account, right now it's not terrible because we're getting between 4 and 5% interest. Inflation from the numbers that we see is less than that. So you're staying ahead of inflation a little bit, but long term, you're unlikely to stay ahead of inflation. You need to invest. Your risk of loss is greater when you put money into the stock market, but your potential for return is also greater. And that's the way that you can really get ahead, by growing at a pace faster than inflation. Because if we think about the old cup of coffee at one point was a quarter, now it's several dollars. When you look at that, like that's what inflation does. So you want to try to stay ahead of inflation. And that tendency to feel I need safety, I want to put the money into the bank, into a CD. But for a longer term cash and needs and retirement, you want to make sure that you have at least some of your money in the stock market. Otherwise, it's going to be really hard to keep up with inflation.
Speaking of like money in the stock market, somebody wanted to, that is an area that I have never, admittedly, like never really improved my IQ in, is like understanding the stock market. I've taken some courses, seminars of like trying to understand the solo 401k and self-funded and like all of that. If somebody wanted to just start understanding the way the stock market works, is there a book or a podcast or a course? Where do you recommend women start with that?
One of my favorite books to recommend is called The Psychology of Money, because a lot of how we think about money, there's a lot of behavioral aspects and a lot of emotions that get in the way. And it really helps you think about those things in a more rational way, and talks about the value of saving and putting money into the market and things like that. That's really good. I have also in the past offered multi-part webinars where I kind of talk about a lot of the basics of finance, because I named my firm Apprise for a reason, because Apprise means to inform. I mentioned before that we don't have much financial education. It's not very good. So I like to take time to explain and try to help people understand about investing, about the market, about anything at all related to their personal finances that they have questions about.
When you say the stock market, I know that there are different types of things in the stock market. There's like the long term, your investments, and then there's actual stocks that you purchase from companies, right? Like Amazon has stocks that you buy. But then what also affects the stock market also affects if you have like a money market account, or if you have some of these other retirement savings accounts.
Stock market doesn't like when you invest, you think about investing in different things. And so you can have individual stocks. Like you said, you can own stock in Amazon. Many people used to use a lot of mutual funds, collections of stocks. They're not as tax efficient. So I use ETFs, very similar to mutual funds, because you can get ETFs that are based upon an index like the S&P 500, which is basically not exactly, but the 500 largest companies in the US in one index. So you buy a little bit of all of them, and they're allocated. Their position in the index is based upon the size of the company. But ETFs trade like stocks do. So you can buy and sell them during the day. Mutual funds can only trade after the market closes. There's some other tax inefficiencies that come with them. Typically, for most of my clients, I would use ETFs because they're more diversified, right? If I can buy an S&P 500 ETF, I basically have a small interest in 500 stocks as opposed to one. If you pick that one stock and it does really well, your performance is going to be great. But if you're wrong, it can have an outsized impact. So when you diversify and own these larger pools through ETFs, it takes some of the volatility out. Because one of the things that we don't like is to lose money. And we can't always avoid it, right? If the market's going to go down, there's just no ways about it. It can't go up every year, because if it did, there'd be no risk, and then the returns would be less. But over the long haul, we do expect the market to go up. I mean, to me, that's why we invest, because we expect the market to go up long term. But if we diversify, we might not get the biggest gains that the market gets, but we also don't get the biggest losses typically. And avoiding the biggest losses, because our minds dislike loss more than they like gains. Minimizing losses actually from a behavioral aspect is more important.
And so what, for somebody listening to talk about like ETFs and stock, mutual funds and all of this, like do you recommend, what are the benefits, I would say, with working like with a company such as yourself who actually manages all of that versus trying to do it yourself and trying to learn how to do that investing? And or do you recommend that people learn to do it themselves and then, so they understand it and then move to a company like yours? Or kind of what do you think for somebody who's just really trying to get a grip on their financial stability and future? How do you think that they should go about that?
So I kind of think about it that anybody in theory can do what I do, but in order to do it, to have what I'll use an acronym KIT, you have to have the knowledge. So that means you have to be willing to spend the time to to learn. You have to have the interest. If it doesn't interest you, then trying to spend time on it is not going to work very well.
Right. Yeah.
And then most importantly, you have to have the time. And as we get older and our time gets sort of like you have your family and you have other responsibilities and your job becomes more complicated, having that time gets harder and harder. And the rules as we go through life, they change. We start out, we're saving for retirement, and we get to the future. And now we're all of a sudden, we're trying to think about how we're going to pull that money out and how we're going to create income from the money that we saved. And those are a different set of rules. I believe that it's not just the portfolio management part that you get working with an advisor. It's also the tax planning, because I look at it, we're not just trying to pay the lowest tax bill this year. We're trying to pay the lowest tax bill over our entire lifetime. And so that might mean paying a little bit more than you would think some years, because it's going to lower your overall costs. Those things are really important. An advisor can help with the behavioral aspect, because I believe in having a process that I follow, dictates when I do things so that it makes it harder for my mind to make me do the wrong thing. There's different ways. You can do it yourself. You can let somebody else do it, or you can do it with somebody. And I have some clients that they kind of manage their portfolio themselves, but I help them on all the other things.
Yeah.
And then there's some people that say, nope, Phil, remember one client, I called her and I asked her a question. And she said to me, Phil, after talking to you, I'm comfortable with what you're doing. I don't really look, and you've made me comfortable. I don't have to look at anything on a regular basis. But now you asked me this question, so I have to go look at my account. And if I'm not happy, it's going to be all your fault, because I wouldn't have even looked if you didn't ask me this question.
Yeah, in my opinion, that's the sign of a great financial planner. Somebody that you could just almost like set it and forget it, and you trust that they're doing their job and just managing it, and they're always looking out for your best interest. For sure. Personal story about really stepping in to manage your family's finances is really, really powerful. And I would love to know and love for you to share with the listeners, like, how did that experience that you went through really shape your mission to help women achieve financial independence?
Growing up in my household, it was that typical model that I talked about, where my father was responsible for the finance. My mother was responsible for taking care of my sister and me. But the only thing was, my father was not good at it, to put it mildly. We had unpaid bills. We had services turned off. We had no credit. We had no savings. I remember when I got my driver's license, having to drive down to like local utilities and give them money so that our services could be turned back on. When it was time for me to go to college, I was told, you can go anywhere you want. With the benefit of hindsight, I should have known that really wasn't true. But I wanted to go to medical school. I was going to be a psychology major. I went to Duke. I did a lot of stuff to stay in school. But my father didn't pay. And after my junior year, done so many things, but we agreed that I was going to leave until I could pay the debt back. I then moved across the country because my situation at home was kind of toxic. I moved to Arizona and I lived there and worked. And when I was ready to go back to school, I decided that because of the debt situation, my grades were good, but I didn't think that they were good enough. I decided I was going to study accounting. And Duke doesn't offer accounting degrees, so going back was no longer an option, even though I really only needed 6 more courses to graduate. So I applied to University of Arizona, I applied to Rutgers, and I came home because I thought that I would get a better job coming out of Rutgers than out of U of A, and I had state residency in both. Like I said before, I paid tuition, I paid my rent, whatever, with credit card checks, because if I didn't have enough, like, to me, this was still good debt because it was going to get me through school to get me that job. I finished school, and while this was all going on, my mother went back to school, and she studied and became an occupational therapist and started her own business. And I know that she did that to get herself on strong enough financial footing that she could be on her own. After I finished school, like I said, I went back and was living at home. One day I got home and I got the mail, and I looked at the mail and there were these bills. They had my name on them. There's only one problem. They weren't mine. After investigating, like, one of the companies sent me a copy of the application. My father forged my name to open up those accounts so that he could get credit. He was paying at least enough to keep them in good stead, but obviously it's not something he should have done. I confronted him. He admitted that he did it. I put in a plan to make them go away, pay them off, but the credit card companies moved those into his name because he was paying them okay. Fast forward a couple of years, my mother was diagnosed with stage 4 breast cancer. And that's when we found out how bad the situation at home really was. And she asked me to help. Those credit cards were now all in collection. My parents had to sell their house. The mortgage rate was way higher than it should have been, and they were behind on the mortgage. I did what I could, but unfortunately my mom didn't make it. She passed away 18 months later. Her breast cancer metastasized to her brain. And so now I view my role, and the reason I work with women facing new beginnings, is I'm trying to help other women avoid the kind of things that my mother went through, to be there and help them with that. And so one of my other things I did, I'm a registered life planner, and when you go through life planning training, you do your own life plan. And so the first element of my life plan is I want to create a scholarship for women to go back to school later in life like my mother did. And ultimately I want to tie a percentage of my firm's revenues to that. I've started putting money away, but I'm far from where I need to be, but that's really what my long-term goal goal would be.
Oh my God. I got chills like 6 times when you're telling your story. It's so inspiring, and so many things that you said resonated in different ways. I lost my father 10 years ago, and I actually endowed a scholarship at a university in his memory to keep that on. So I understand the importance of really wanting to your parents' legacy to live on. So I love that. Well, you mentioned life planning, which is interesting. Can you walk us through really how this approach, life planning, really differs from financial planning, and why is it so critical for women, especially in midlife?
When I first started doing life planning, I thought about it as aligning your values with how you spend your money. But I've now evolved to where I think it's more than that. Think about it. We have kind of four main resources that we can use. And it's our team. Again, it's an acronym. We have our time, our energy, our attention, and our money. And if we can align those with our values, we're going to live a more fulfilled life. And so the life planning process, it starts with, it's also got an acronym called EVOKE. And that first E is exploration, where we kind of talk about dream big. What would be your most fulfilled life? What is it that really motivates you? What is it that's really important to you? And then we have some inspirational exercises that we give you to complete and to create a vision. And so there's 3 questions that we ask and discuss. The first one is, imagine that money was no object. What would you do? How would you live your life? That's a really easy, it's a dream big question, pretty easy to answer. Well, it can be hard, but it's not emotional to answer that question, but they do start to get more emotional. The second question is, this time you go to the doctor. You get the unfortunate news, you have 5 to 10 years left to live. The good news is you're not ever going to feel sick, but the bad news is you don't know when you're going to go. Now, and money is part of the equation. So now it's not about this, dream big. Now it's like, what would you do and how would you change? And then we get to the third question, which is really the hardest one of all. This time you go to the doctor and you get the unfortunate news. Today's the day. I know it's a really emotional thing to think about. And now, while some people might answer it away, it's not about what would you do. It's what did you not get to do and who did you not get to be? And so the idea here is it's not about regret. It's about avoiding regret. Let's identify those things that are really important to you now so that we can start to do them so that you don't get to end of life not having done those things. So this is all about priorities, right? It's setting your priorities, those things that really matter. You mentioned like the Starbucks 3 times a week. You can go to Starbucks 3 times a week if that's really important to you, but then you have to think about what you're not going to do because you're doing that. And that's what this really helps you put in focus, those things that really matter to you. And we focus on them. And then we get to O, which is where we talk about the things that could get in the way and how do we address those. And all these is not really me telling you, it's me listening to you and letting you think about it and talk about it and work through it. And then comes the K, which is the knowledge, where that's where the role is advisors. Now we want to put this into a financial plan, and this financial plan is going to have those things that are really important to you. And then the last E is execute. Let's go out and do it. And so it can be so helpful. Like I'll be talking to somebody and there's something really important going on. I'm like, let's work on your life. And it can make such a big difference. Like I have a client, right after I got back from the middle part of the training, I got this email from her, Phil, I just took a leave of absence from work. I don't know what I'm going to do. I don't know what it means. I don't know how it affects my financial plan, but I did it. So I started to email her. I'm like, this is not the time for an email. I'm going to call. So I called her. I said, what's going on? And she told me. And so she had a really stressful job. Her boss was really difficult. The first of their 2 daughters had just gone to college. So she was experiencing that empty nest and she was on the phone with her daughter 2, 3 in the morning. Then you got to go to work. That's not easy to do. Their other daughter was in high school going through her things. I said, all right, let's do your life plan. So we did it. She ended up leaving that job. Now, like when I talk to her and I look at her, she's like a different person. I can see it in her face. I can hear it in her voice. She's so much happier. She's doing those things that she wants. A year later, I got another email from her. She said, so when I was in my 20s, I used to go to baseball games and watch the older women there working as ushers and said, I want to do that. So she's only in her 50s, but that's what she's done. So she said, I went onto the team's website and I applied for the job. I went in for my interview where I'm wearing team's jersey, shirt from when they won the World Series. There's all these young kids there. I got the job. So she worked for this team all season long. It wasn't like it was for good pay, but this is something she really wanted to do. And by doing her life plan and realizing that she was in position, I mean, fortunately she was in position to be able to do all this, but now she got to do that. I won't do it again, but she still got to do it. And that's it. Like, and all the things that she's doing now are all those things that we talked about. It's not exactly how we laid it out in her life plan, but it's much more in line with, she's so much happy.
God, I love this idea of a life plan. And I'm like, Phil, where were you 5 years ago when I wanted to leave my corporate job? And I was like, all the things, but there's so many women who are listening to this who have maybe, they're looking to really improve their financial situation, especially after a big life change like divorce. They are looking, a lot of women too, whether or not they've even gone through divorce, a lot of women I know in midlife want to leave their corporate job and maybe become an entrepreneur, but that can feel scary. What are maybe some examples of things that you would talk through with them if somebody was wanting wanting to either start like a side hustle while they're working their corporate job and then plan to leave their corporate job, are there any maybe tips or things that they should think about that could maybe fall into part of their life plan as they plan to make that transition from a side hustle to a full-time career as an entrepreneur?
Honestly, that's what I did.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. And so the key thing for me was that I had saved along the way so that I had some cushion to get to where I could grow my business. I mean, I remember when I started my business and people talking to me like, the first year it sucked. The second year wasn't much better. But then by year 3, that's when I knew I really had a business. I remember at the beginning of that year, my wife said to me, this is the year, either it happens this year or you're going to have to go back and get that corporate job.
I get that.
That's an important part. It's just you want to be able to have something so that you have the time to let it. So starting with a side hustle can really help because now you still got that other income coming in while you're making this transition. If not, it's really important that you have something to help you get through because when you run a business, it's really important. Like I think about it that I want to run a business that I would invest in as an investor. So I want to make sure that I make good, solid, long-term decisions. That's really important. I don't want to make really short-sighted decisions. I think that's important. I like the idea that you can have something that has an ongoing recurring revenue type model. I think that's better than where it's one time if you can do that. But the key thing is just to be prepared and know that it's not going to be easy.
That's true. You had a leg up though, because you were very well versed. For me, I joke about this all the time. One of the things, especially when you are in my industry and the online coaching space, one of the things that people don't really talk about is, oh, you decide you want to become a coach. But what they don't tell you is that, oh yeah, and by the way, you also need to understand how to become a CFO. You also need to understand how to become a CMO, a CTO, a customer service expert. I mean, I got to tell you, I'm 5 years in and man, I have learned some hard lessons on becoming a CFO for my business and really understanding. I've always been the kind of person actually so willing to invest, almost to my detriment though, to the point where you have to sometimes you have to rein that in a little bit when you're getting going with your business. So God, I think anybody who is wanting to start their own business, hiring some like a Phil to do some life planning for you, I wish I would have done that because I had to learn the hard way. There were some hard years when I was starting my business, and any entrepreneur that is honest about it will tell you that financially can be a scary place to be sometimes as an entrepreneur. And there were days where I was waking up, some days where I was trying to figure out where this much money left on this credit card and I can leverage this and I think I can get credit for this and I can do this. And I mean, that is a soul sucking way to live. I mean, I'm glad I don't live like that anymore, but any entrepreneur, if they're being honest, will tell you that can feel like that.
It sure can. And you talked about all those things you have to do. I remember telling myself that every time I make a decision to do one thing, there's something else I'm not doing. So you have to be really thoughtful about how you allocate your time. And you mentioned having a coach. Like one of the smartest things I did was my business was a little over a year old. I had tried working with some firm to help me with some stuff and I didn't like how it went. And I talked to somebody who was an advisor who now coaches just advisors. And I really couldn't afford it. But I said, I need this because while I have a lot of the knowledge about, I've never marketed. Like I remember the first guy I worked with, like, how many people out there are marketers? And nobody raises their hand. Guess what? You're all marketers because how are you going to get business, right?
As I tell my clients, listen, I'm going to teach you not just how to coach, but how to become a master marketer. Because if you don't learn this, no one's going to buy your stuff. You have to learn that. So yeah, it's tough, right?
It's very tough. Having that coach really helped because that gave me a sounding board of somebody that had experience. And there's a lot of decisions that I made that he was very helpful in. Or one of the first things that we did was, let's look at how you're spending your time and what benefit are you getting from that? And it made me eliminate a lot of things that I was doing that really weren't bringing any value.
A book I'm reading right now, which I'm sure you've read this, is Profit First do you know what book I'm talking about? Have you read that? It's just a very interesting approach to like not making your business like a money sucking machine. And yeah, so I do agree. I think that having coaches in different areas, like the financial piece of it, having a coach like that maybe can help you like with the marketing piece of it, all of those things can be learned skills, but having somebody to guide you with it will save you, number one, a lot of time and stress and all of that, but also a lot of money. Because the amount of money I wasted making decisions that I probably, just because when you're starting off as an entrepreneur, like you really have no idea what you're doing unless you went to work and you have an MBA. For the most part, you have no idea what you're doing when you start a business at all. That can be a game changer for hiring somebody. Well, one of the things you talked about a minute ago was is tax planning. And I know that that can be often overlooked, but it can make a huge difference, as you've also stated. And what are some tax saving strategies that every woman in midlife should know in order to make the most of her retirement savings?
I think one of the key things that I look at, and I mentioned it before, is thinking about what kind of taxes you're going to pay today, what the rate is, and what the rate's going to be in the future. Because we think about saving for retirement, and so many people are like, I'm just going to put money in my 401k, or I'm going to put money in my IRA. But remember, there's a Roth 401k, there's a Roth IRA. And the difference between the two is that when you put it into an IRA or a 401k, a regular one, you don't pay tax on the money that goes into the account. You don't pay tax on the growth that the account gets, but you pay taxes, you pull the money out. With a Roth, you pay the taxes, you put in after-tax dollars, but you don't pay tax on the growth or when you pull the money out. And you want to think about, because when your tax rate is low, like if you have a child that's starting school or starting work, it's really good, or even if they have a summer job, they can fund a Roth and they can do that and they'll have all this money that can grow tax-free for years and years and years. Like I was in the car with my son. I have a son that lives on the other side of the country. He works for Amazon Web Services. And I was talking to him and we were talking about, he put money into his Roth and the money he saved. I said, I said, when I'm gone, you're going to really thank me because you're going to be able to retire earlier and all this other stuff because we're doing all this because we talked about this and we're doing all these things. And I know that I put that in the context of my son, but for any age, you want to think about saving in different ways because when you get to where you start to pull that money out, they all have different tax treatment. Like one thing that a lot of people overlook is think about healthcare. And a lot of us have these high deductible healthcare plan. If you have an HSA, health savings account, don't use it to fund your current expenses if you don't have to, because that is even more tax efficient than the regular IRA or the Roth because you don't pay tax on the money when it goes in. You don't pay tax. You can invest it and get it growth and you don't pay tax on that. And as long as you had qualified medical expenses, they don't even have to be the year you pull them out, just while the HSA, if you had unreimbursed medical expenses, you can pull that out tax free. So that's another way to save for retirement that's really, really tax efficient because it's triple tax free.
I'm so glad you mentioned the HSA thing because that is something that I learned in this seminar that I went to. And I want to ask you a question regarding that seminar, but that was something that I learned about, which was, that's a really important tip that I don't want the listeners to miss. What you're saying is let your HSA just grow and don't take money out right now for like current medical expenses. Like use your like post-tax dollars just to pay for it and let that thing grow and grow as much as possible. I know a lot of entrepreneurs use that HSA to really, to put money, to really fund that and max it out because of that. That is, you talk to all these like top percenters, these billionaires and all of that, they're doing all of that, right? Aren't they really leveraging HSAs and all of that to maximize their retirement savings, right?
That's right. It's just not enough people are doing it, but more and more are becoming aware of the value that it provides.
So the seminar that I went to is really interesting. And this, I don't want to get in the weeds this necessarily, but guys, this was all about really talking about what kind of these billionaires, how they operate and talking about like using companies like Equity. I think it's Equity Trust. Is that Equity Trust, the self-directed IRAs and all of that? I don't know if you're familiar with that company, but do you know what I'm talking about I'm sure you do, but like self-directed, right? They were talking about the use of family banking and like all of that, creating these are really upper high level wealth strategies, right? But can you just clarify though, like when you hear about the difference between self-directed versus like using somebody like you or like a Charles Schwab, that if somebody's heard that term thrown around, really what is the difference there?
Self-directed basically means that you're not having somebody else involved in the decision making. You're doing it yourself.
You just do it yourself. And aren't there different tax benefit, or I don't know, are there tax benefits related to being self-directed versus having somebody like you or Charles Schwab do it?
There shouldn't be. I mean, the main time that I can think that self-directed really matters and where I can't play the same role would be if there are special ones where if you want to invest in real estate through your IRA, that's when you need a firm that specializes in working in real estate because there's a lot of rules related to that. And you just have to be careful because let's say that you buy something that's supposed to be a fixer-upper and you have X number, let's say you had $300,000 in your IRA and you spent $225,000 on the home. It better not be more than $75,000 to fix it up because guess what? If it is, you don't have the money to fund it. And then if you have to inject outside money in, it can impair your IRA, cause a whole host of problems. So you just have to be careful with that. But that's the type of situation where there are specific firms that you have to work with when it involves real estate because Otherwise you can't, because it's got to be in the right vehicle to be an IRA, treated as an IRA.
That's why I just want to encourage the listeners, as you're starting to get into really improving your financial IQ and you start learning about all of these different ways to invest, like just do your homework, because there are sometimes people can make certain things appear very, very shiny. And there's definitely maybe some hidden drawbacks that they're not sharing. So just like do your homework. I remember I left this conference and I was ready to fire my financial planner, and I was ready to move, hire a company like Equity Trust and start doing, and what they talked about is eventually like then changing your tax structure to a Rob structure, doing all of these really high level, different planning strategies. But when I really started digging in and diving in, I just realized for me that it just wasn't the right move for me. And I needed to kind of like stay where I was at. So it's just like do your homework on figuring out how you're going to invest your money. So just a few more questions as we start to wrap this up. I would love to just know what advice, we talked a little bit about, retirement and saying that it's never too early and it's never too late. But for somebody who's really in midlife, who's approaching retirement and she's really feeling the squeeze, she did start planning too late. Are there steps that she can do now to catch up, or anything that you would recommend that she could do to really maximize the time she has left?
Well, when you are putting money into your 401k or your IRA, like there are additional amounts that you can put into the account based upon your age. Mm-hmm. So don't forget about that. If you turn 50, then the amount that you can put in a 401k this year goes up by $7,500 more. An IRA goes up $1,000 more. We mentioned health savings accounts, and the contribution, it's $55 for that. You can put in an extra $1,000. If you've maxed these out, don't forget about and just put money into taxable savings. That's not a terrible thing, because it's actually it's not the worst, because if you get capital gains, they're taxed at a lower rate than ordinary income is. So you can think about that. I mean, there's things depending upon how your accounts are set up. If you're over the income limit to put into an IRA, you can do something called a backdoor Roth IRA. Mm-hmm. There's even something, and I'm not going to get into the specifics of those.
That was one of the things I learned about in the conference, Phil. So I know what you're talking about, and I'm proud to say that I do.
Okay.
I mean, basically, we could just tell listeners, basically what that is, if I remember correctly, if I regurgitate this correctly, a backdoor IRA is where you are, let me think about this, where you're pulling from aren't you pulling from like your Roth IRA and like putting it into like something that's with the Roth and the IRA or something. Yeah. So just, what is it again, just real quickly?
Sure. You make a non-deductible contribution to your IRA, because I said you're over the income limit. And then you take that and convert it, do a Roth conversion to make it into a Roth. The limitation on that is if you have a rollover IRA or a regular IRA already, that transaction's taxable. If all your money's in a 401k or a 403b or something like that, that's a company plan, then it's not taxable. So you just want to make sure, because it can get kind of hairy if you have the other, the rollover IRA or the regular IRA when you do it. But if you don't, then it's a really good transaction. I have a lot of clients who do that.
Okay, so continue on. So I guess I knew what it was kind of, but then I had to think about, because it's kind of complicated, but go ahead.
So like I said, don't forget about your taxable account, but fully max out all your retirement accounts to the extent that you can. And when you're thinking about your investing, you want to think about trying to make it as we gave a little bit of talk before to the idea of diversifying your portfolio, like owning different things. But also we want to think about what we own and which type of account, because of the tax treatment. This is called asset location. That matters. If you have family, depending upon the size of your portfolio, you want to think about how to transfer things. Like another thing too, I want to just give a really broad tip is make sure, and this really matters for women going through divorce, beneficiary designations on your accounts trump or overrule anything that's in your will. If you get divorced and you had a 401k and you don't change the beneficiary from your ex, guess what happens if you pass away? Your ex gets the money. Even if you had a will that said it goes to somebody else, doesn't matter. Beneficiary designations on accounts. Well, there was a story in the Wall Street Journal a couple months ago about this guy. He was dating this girl in the 70s, and he made her the beneficiary of his 401k. They were going to get married. They didn't, because he didn't want to have kids, so she moved on. He never changed it.
Oh my God.
He passed away a few years ago, and his family is still trying to fight, and they haven't won, and they're not gonna to try to get the money. She gets the money because she's the beneficiary of the account, even though they hadn't talked in 20 years or 30 years. It doesn't matter. Who you set up as your beneficiary, that's who gets the money. When you go through divorce, you want to make sure your life insurance, your bank accounts, your savings accounts, your retirement accounts, all those things, change the beneficiary to who you want it to be. Don't leave your ex.
Can you do it to your kids who are under 18 though?
You can. It's just that what happens is if you were to go before they're 18, that it would go into a trust. So you want to make sure that there's a trustee named someplace, like that would be named in your will, or you could put it on the beneficiary designation if you have something already set up. So yes, you can.
So you can, in a sense, if you want, like if you had a good co-parenting situation, you could leave it to your kids, but set up in your will your ex as like their dad as the trustee. Is that
Yes.
right? Okay.
Yes.
Well, last question I would love for you to answer is for women approaching retirement, what's the most important question they should ask themselves to ensure that they're financially prepared? What's the most important thing they should ask?
That's a really good question. I'll go back to life planning, and I want to make sure that you know what it is that you want to do. I think that's really important. When I talk to people and they're not sure, and we go through the life planning process, when they're done, they have a much better idea. I think that's really important because I talked before about that team of resources that we have and aligning that with your values. You really want to know those things that are important because it's so easy to look at our neighbor and look at their house or look at their car or look at their jewelry or something else and want that. A lot of times it doesn't really matter to us. You want to make sure that you know those things that really matter. And that's what you want to direct your money towards. And as you approach retirement, you definitely want to start to think about taxes because like I said, the rules flip kind of when we think about going from saving for retirement to spending in retirement. So as we approach retirement, that's when tax planning becomes even more.
Love that. Such great advice, Phil. This has been incredible, not only for the listeners, but for myself as well. I have so enjoyed this conversation. Where can the listeners find out more about Apprise Wealth Management, how to work with you and your team, and what you guys have going on to help women in midlife really take control of their finances?
My website is Apprise Wealth, APPRISE wealth.com. You can go there. I blog every week, so you can sign up for the blog. If you go to apprisewealth.com/assessment, I have an assessment that kind of helps you look at where might you be if you're thinking about life planning your finances. It takes like 2 minutes to complete. It's just a bunch of yes or no type questions. And you can also go there and I'll talk to you. There's no charge for that initial consultation. I never would charge anybody unless they decided that it was the right fit for them and for me to work together. So you can schedule a call yourself. You don't have to contact me first. You can just go ahead and schedule a call.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. And we will have that link in the show notes. I really appreciate your time, Phil.
Thank you so much for having me, Amber. I really enjoyed it. Love the conversation.
Absolutely. Me as well.